Now, Unicef says climate change is driving the worst drought in Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia, which hasn't been seen in 40 years. The number of people without reliable access to safe water across these countries has risen from 9.5 million to 16.2 million people. This is in the space of 5 months. For more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Sam Godfrey from the UNICEF's regional office, and he will be speaking on these developments. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Dr. Godfrey. Maybe let's start with the significance of Water Week and the importance of this week to highlight some of the challenges in the Horn of Africa.
Many thanks. Water issues are everywhere. If the 20th century was really, the century of oil, the 21st century is surely the decades of water. All countries, I think all people, all communities around the world are really cognizant and really understand the importance now of water. Too much water, droughts and floods, etc. And this is certainly the case now in the Horn of Africa, where, as you said in your introduction, the numbers of people without reliable access to safe water has risen to more than 16 million in the last 5 months. And this announcement in our report comes really at a time of the World Water Week, which is entitled Seeing the Unseen, the Value of Water. And we're really trying to put a spotlight on the issue of the rising prices and hiking prices of water in the Horn of Africa. For example, we've seen in Mandera here in Kenya a 400% price increase, a price hike since January 2021 as a result of the scarcity of water. And similarly, we've seen similar cases in Ethiopia where the price of water has almost doubled just due to the scarcity of water.
Now, Dr. Godfrey, I understand, of course, that children would be one of those that are most affected by this issue. Maybe take us through the challenges of what the people in the Horn of Africa are suffering under in terms of disease, as well as issues around lack of water.
Well, limited water, of course, results in water-washed and waterborne diseases. This current crisis in the Horn of Africa is exacerbating the outbreaks of cholera and acute watery diarrhea. We've seen 8,200 cases of cholera reported between January and June of this year, which is more than double the numbers in Somalia from last year. And 2/3 of those affected, of course, are children under 5. Similarly, we have seen about 1.8 million children in the Horn of Africa affected by severe acute malnutrition as a result of the lack of access of water to improve food security and overall health and hygiene.
Can you describe for us just how dire this situation is for somebody who doesn't understand the use and how important water is?
I think the best way to describe this is really as clearly a children's emergency. We're familiar with the issues of quantity and quality and pricing of water. If we consider that in most households, an individual would use around 20 litres of water for their personal consumption, cooking, domestic use per day. Currently in Somalia, Ethiopia and Kenya, the average usage is 2 litres per person per day. And similarly, when we look at the pricing of water, at the moment we are seeing prices of up to $10 per 200 litres consumed by a household, which is actually 50 times more than the price that might be paid, for example, in most parts of South Africa, but also of Europe. So the water is becoming scarcer, it's becoming more expensive, and it's forcing families to move and be displaced from their areas of settlement. And this, of course, is causing conflict and all kinds of disruption to the delivery of basic social services. The fundamental message here is that water is the root of this crisis. Climate change is aggravating the availability of water in the Horn of Africa, and there's a need for us to join hands and invest in climate-resilient water supply solutions to be able to break this vicious cycle of the water drought in the Horn of Africa.
Dr. Godfrey, would you say that we're seeing adequate intervention when it comes to governments, not only in the Horn of Africa, because even here in the South, we are having issues when it comes to the availability of water? Are governments doing enough to mitigate what is taking place, or are they wanting in this manner?
One of the key mitigation measures and one of the real issues that needs to be looked at by governments is in terms of regulating the quantity and the pricing of water. As you correctly say, this is an issue which is affecting most of East and Southern Africa, but it's obviously more stark in areas which are affected by severe droughts. The conflict over the use of water is only increasing in East and Southern Africa, with a huge and growing demand for water for agriculture, for livestock, and even for industry. And of course, this is then putting domestic water supplies under even increased pressure. And so a key role that governments can play is in putting in place the sector building blocks to ensure that regulation of water is done effectively. And the most disadvantaged populations, particularly those low-income households and children within those low-income households, are protected from some of the dangers of the scarcity of water.
I imagine, Dr. Godfrey, that UNICEF is trying to play its part in trying to mitigate the effects of the lack of water. Maybe talk us through some of your interventions as an organization.
Well, UNICEF is active in Ethiopia and Somalia and Kenya, and with its partners has already delivered climate resilient water supplies to more than 500,000 people. And those are really focused on accessing and exploring more sustainable, deeper aquifers, moving water from those aquifers through large transmission and water transferal schemes from one part of a district or a province to another where the population stands, whilst at the same time also addressing the life-saving needs of children and women in those communities by distribution of humanitarian aid, such as hygiene products, increased storage facilities for households, and also tankering of water. But we should be clear that the response to the Horn of Africa this year is nowhere near what we had seen in the previous droughts in 2016 or even in 2010, even though we are declaring that this is one of the worst droughts that's been seen in the Horn of Africa. Currently, the water appeal from UNICEF for the Horn of Africa is only 3% funded. And there's a tremendous deficit in terms of financial resources. And so there is a need for increased investment in not only the response, but also the longer term to work with all partners to achieve this.
Maybe then, Dr. Godfrey, is there anything one can do perhaps in changing their day-to-day routines to try and save water in this instance?
Absolutely. The water conservation measures which we can take individually are key, whether we live in rural households or even urban households. Ensuring that we are managing our water effectively and also capturing as much as we can the runoff and the rainfall from our water to reuse it, recycle it, and regain some of the nutrients from it is critical both for agriculture, food security, but also just for domestic cleanliness and hygiene. Water, of course, is the gold of our era. It's a precious commodity. It's very, very much under threat. Across the world, we are seeing massive challenges being faced from China all the way to Chile of how to manage water. In Africa itself, we have an abundance of underground water, and we need as well individually and collectively as professionals with government to find innovative ways to both develop, use, consume and manage this water for the children of the future.
Just to touch on that, Dr. Godfrey, you put it as water is the gold of our era, just to show the importance of this particular resource. And you're saying that we need to look at innovative ways. Have you seen any of those perhaps taking place in how countries in Africa are trying to manage water? Are there any innovations taking place?
One of the key innovations over the last couple of decades in Africa relates to the interface between the telecommunications sector and the water sector. The water sector has benefited hugely from the advent of low-lying satellite technology and mobile phone technology, which of course has enabled water professionals to be able to have a bird's eye view using satellite images of where water exists, how it moves, how it can be managed. We have much better and innovative technologies now also for penetrating subsoils to be able to understand where water exists deep in the ground using a combination of satellite and radar technology. So there are a lot of innovations within Africa which are helping us not only locate and understand where this water, this precious commodity exists, but also to then monitor the trends of how it's being used, how it's moving, and how it's potentially being overexploited. The future definitely lies in making sure that technologically we are at the cutting edge within Africa to be able to manage our water resources so that, again, we preserve it and conserve it for the future generations.
And maybe then, are you able to tell us how Africa is faring against the rest of the world when it comes to water as a resource?
Well, the real issue has been that as we transition from the Millennium Development Goals in 2015 into the Sustainable Development Goals, the baseline for Africa was relatively low in comparison to some of the other regions of the world. But what we've seen in the last 5 or 10 years is that a lot of the infrastructure that was built in Asia, in Latin America, and even in Europe is being heavily affected by climatic shocks. We're seeing large swathes of infrastructure being washed away by droughts, most recently in Europe last summer. We're also seeing large infrastructure systems and schemes that were built in Latin America that were not built to be resilient to these climatic shocks. For example, in northern Brazil, where there's been a huge drought for many, many years and has left millions of people without access to infrastructure. The taps have literally run dry. So in Africa, although the baseline was low, we are beginning to see investments now which are more strategic, which are more adapted to these climatic shocks that we know are here to stay. And so perhaps in 5 or 10 years' time, we are going to see a large number of those forms of infrastructure actually being in place and being more resilient. Last week, for example, I visited a water scheme between the border of Djibouti and Ethiopia in the drought-affected areas. And this was a scheme that was built in 2018, 4 years ago, using satellite technology to identify very deep aquifers. Unicef constructed this scheme for 15,000 people. And it's one of the schemes that is still functioning within this drought period because, again, it has been designed to be resilient to the climatic shocks that we are facing as humanity today in 2022.
Quite an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That is Dr. Sam Godfrey, UNICEF's Regional Advisor on Water, Sanitation, Hygiene and Climate for Eastern and Southern Africa.